Good morning. Welcome to Westside Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Ellen Greenwood, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And it is my privilege to be the worship associate for the service this morning. Westside is a congregation that welcomes each person who comes into our community with an open heart and an open mind, regardless of the path you have taken to get here. We welcome all of those of you who are here in person, and also all of those of you who are joining us on YouTube, either right now in the present time or at some later time. If you're here with us in person this morning, please stay after our service for coffee and tea and conversation. And remember that right after we've had a chance for coffee time at 12:30, our workshop will begin with Kalil White, Challenging White Supremacy and Internal Bias. And I think it should be a very interesting and enlightening workshop. Personally, I'm really looking forward to it. And that is the only announcement that I have. There are announcements in our order of service and on our screen up here and also on your screen at home. Be sure and pay attention to those so you'll know what's happening around Westside. But with that in mind, let's put all of that out of our mind, and Reverend Carol will invite our singing bowl to sing.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to see you all. Welcome to Westside. I'm Reverend Carol Badeau, privileged to serve here as minister. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I, again, want to extend a special welcome to those who are with us virtually. Always remember that you are an important part of our community. One further announcement is just a reminder that because of our workshop with Kalil White that ends at 3, Earth Church starts late today. So typically Earth Church starts at 2. Today we'll be starting at 3. So today we're going to be challenging a particular internal bias that I know I was raised with. So today's service is about the idea of America as being super great and awesome and better than everybody else. And I was raised with that. And that's an internal idea I've had to struggle with some in my life. So we're going to talk about that today. So as I invite the bowl to sound, what I want to invite you to do is first just take 2 deep breaths and find your body. And second, solidly centered in your body, open your mind and open your heart and be willing to be surprised, to be changed, to be challenged, to hear something that maybe you've never heard before, and maybe something you've heard before to hear in a different way. So the bowl invites us into that opening space.
As Reverend Carol prepares to light our chalice, I'm reminded that every Sunday when I see the lighting of our chalice here at Westside, I'm encouraged by knowing that Unitarian Universalist congregations all across our country, and in fact in other parts of the world, are lighting their chalices as well. It may be a large congregation with hundreds of members, or a tiny fellowship with only a few members. It may be a beautiful handcrafted chalice similar to the one that we light, or it may be a 50-cent candle in a chip saucer. But the reflected values are the same. And these values are described on the UUA's worship web by Deborah Falk in these words: "A chalice lit in our midst is a symbol of our liberal faith, a faith built on the foundation of freedom, reason, and tolerance, a faith sustained by acts of kindness and justice, a faith that visions a world flourishing with equality for all her people, a faith that demands the living out of goodness, a faith that requires thoughtfulness, a faith that requires wholeness. This tiny flame is the symbol of the spark of all this within each of us." And also, as we light our chalice each Sunday, we light 2 community candles, one for the bad in the world and one for the good. And our world is hurting in some by the white establishment. It hit most of us especially hard as we watched the heartbreaking video of his murder on the national media. We light a candle of caring this morning for all the Black lives lost to police violence. And similarly, we light a candle of hope for progress that has been made and hopefully will continue to be made. This is also kind of a candle of concern, I'm afraid. I recently saw this statement from Abba Blankston, a spokesperson for the NAACP. So as we say, this anniversary is not about grief or recovering from trauma. It is about purpose and being dedicated and recommitting to ensuring that the country is open to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that our country continues to maintain equal justice under the law. And I see lots of heads shaking, but we're working on it. At this time, we will have some music, primarily by the choir. The choir will come forward. We're going to sing "Our World is One World," and the words will be up on the wall. If you feel inclined to join us, please do so.
Seas that wash around about, the clouds that come
So first, a big thanks to Jan Coe and Pat Luna for sharing music with us. Thank you to them. So hearing a different call, that is part of being Unitarian Universalist. Part of being Unitarian Universalist is looking at things carefully and not just assuming that what we were told is the truth, being willing to ask questions, being curious, hearing a different voice than maybe the voice of the dominant culture. So I want to begin today by asking you a simple question. Do you think America is special? Yeah. And how special? There's a lot of answers to that question. Let me expand the question a bit bigger. Because do we think America is special is a pretty easy question, at least for me to answer, of course. Of course America is special. But here's a bigger question. Do I have a core assumption that the United States of America is so unique and so special that it is superior? And that its way of doing things has a calling on the world stage over other cultures? That's a subtle difference, isn't it? So the question of whether or not any given group of people has a special or unique or collective identity, that's something at the core of all national and cultural identities. Think about that for a moment. All cultures throughout time have identified themselves as unique in some way. That's part of a culture, right? Unitarian Universalists do it. We think of the ways we're unique and special and different from other cultures, other religious cultures. And that is true of pretty much any nation or culture in the world that we can think of. But we don't tend to think about how that works very much. It's not mostly conscious. It's mostly unconscious. It's mostly taught in all kinds of subtle ways that we don't stop to think about. At the core of self-defined identity, there is always some sense of uniqueness. Frequently, that uniqueness, that sense of uniqueness, is also accompanied by a sense of betterness. Right? Think about the distinction there. Often, particularly in terms of cultures or communities that are religiously rooted, that betterness comes with the language of being divinely guided, divinely protected, somehow chosen, right? And this is absolutely true of this nation that we live in. In America, our national origins are tied to very clearly tied to stories of immigrants who came with a sense of being divinely chosen. Most of us haven't thought much about that part of the story, but that's the story. So I'm going to ask you a question, and then we're going to go into the history of this phrase. How many of you are familiar with the language of America being a city on a hill? How many of you have heard that? The city on a hill. Okay. So that phrase has been used over and over again in political speeches over the last roughly 75 years. And I was actually, and conveniently, getting a PhD in early American literature the first time that I heard that used in a political context. When I heard the phrase city on a hill used to describe the American political, cultural identity. I can remember hearing President Ronald Reagan draw out that particular metaphor, which was throughout his presidency, central to the framing of how he described his role and our nation's role in the world. And I've, of course, heard it many, many times since, but where does it come from? And why is it so popular as a metaphor for our nation? And what does it have to do with this idea of America being exceptional? What implications does that image have for our idea of ourselves, right, as a community? Now, the reason it is important that I was studying American literature when I first heard that phrase is that actually I was studying American religious literature. I was in a graduate program studying early American literature and history, particularly religious history and literature. When I heard that phrase, city on a hill, that phrase has now become synonymous with the concept of American exceptionalism. We're special, we're unique. And it's at the core of the ways we have come to think of ourselves as a nation. It is, at its most basic, Christian evangelical language. So the phrase comes from the book of Matthew, from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Okay? This is the sermon that Jesus gave that includes the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor of spirit. Yeah. Anybody familiar with those? Some of you are like, yep, I was raised in that. I heard that before. So it's that sermon. That sermon is also where the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, right? The Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, and the City on a Hill passage are all in the same sermon that Jesus gave. And the passage in which the city on a hill is included says this: "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. People do not light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. Rather, they put it in a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." So that's the passage. Now, we're going to go back in history and we're going to trace what's happened to the way we think of ourselves as a nation related to that. So imagine yourself, it's March of 1630. We're in a church in Southampton, England. And the first group of colonists, sponsored by the Massachusetts Bay Colony Organization, are getting ready to get on a ship, the Arabella, to come to the New World, the so-called New World, okay? And the governor of this little group, John Winthrop, gives a sermon, and he titles it "A Model of Christian Charity." And at the end, he quotes this passage from the book of Matthew about the city on a hill at the end of his sermon, warning the group that will be watched by all the world, and they are to be an exemplar, a model for the whole world to follow. So essentially, the passage and then Winthrop's use of it are evangelical. They're saying we got to spread the right stuff, not the wrong stuff. And that particular passage and that particular sermon by Governor Winthrop, even the boat he was on and the people on the boat pretty much went unnoticed for a couple hundred years of people writing American history. That wasn't what American history focused on for a long, long time. There was other stuff that people were telling stories about, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that particular story wasn't a big deal. But in the middle of the 20th century, America was redefining itself in the wake of a civil war and 2 world wars, right? We'd had a civil war and then 2 world wars, and by the middle of the 20th century, there was this effort to redefine America after all that struggle and strife. And this particular narrative from John Winthrop, preaching to those settlers, got revived, it got picked up. And basically, the promotional campaign was massive, okay? Now, the particular scholar who did this was a guy named Perry Miller, whom I happened to be studying when I was doing my PhD work in 1989 when Ronald Reagan gave that particular speech. So I happened to have been reading Perry Miller, and I happened to have read A Model of Christian Charity, and then I heard President Reagan use it, and I thought, so something is happening. Something is happening here, right? So in the mid-1950s, Perry Miller, who was a scholar of American history and literature, and a whole bunch of other scholars were trying to come up with a coherent narrative, an appealing narrative, a unifying narrative about America's uniqueness rooted in its origins. So again, there's this idea of America being special and exceptional, rooted in something unique about us. And Perry Miller landed on the idea that it was our Puritan origins that made us special. How many of you, when you were in elementary school, heard the story of this country as being about the Pilgrims? There you go. You all were included in the cultural conditioning that said America's origin is Puritan. The story of religiously oppressed people, divinely guided and inspired for religious freedom to come to this new land. So that's the narrative. That narrative really became popular starting in about the 50s. So Perry Miller said, well, that's what it is. It's this Puritan thing that makes us special. And he went through a bunch of texts. And he said this speech that John Winthrop delivered in 1630 was really the root of it. The city on a hill message was the root of American uniqueness. And he felt totally justified in creating a national narrative based on that 1630 voyage, despite the existence of a whole lot of other cultures, not Puritan, a whole lot of other settlers who were here before that, a whole lot of other people who didn't fit that narrative, who were already here in 1630. So previous groups such as the Spanish, who established St. Augustine in 1565, the English Virginia Company, who were Anglican, who came in 1607, the Dutch, who were in Manhattan in 1609, the itinerant separatists who founded Plymouth in 1620, they were Puritan, and other Puritans coming earlier than that. And that doesn't even begin to mention the many communities of indigenous peoples who had been here for centuries. Miller dismissed all these. And this is a quote from Perry Miller. He said, "Their stories lacked coherence with which I could coherently begin a narrative." So that's why we all have to make pilgrim hats in November in elementary school. Okay? So this was actually a promotional campaign by scholars. So Perry Miller, post-World War II, gave America a narrative rooted in the Puritan ethos and their evangelical fervor, and it really took off. Okay? Now, before Perry Miller, he published this in 1956 in a book called Errand into the Wilderness. Before Perry Miller published that, history texts did not focus on the arrival of that group of Puritans on the ship the Arabella and John Winthrop's speech. They certainly didn't include the sermon or this whole idea of a city on a hill. But by 2010, not only did most American history texts refer specifically to the city on a hill idea and to the sermon, lots of them, like I know school kids now who have to read a model of Christian charity in high school. Like that has become a thing. One 2010 school history textbook is actually titled City on a Hill. This is how cultural identity formation happens. There's a history to how we tell history. Now, since Perry Miller, pretty much every president has used the city. The political speechwriters love this. I have a personal theory that a lot of political speechwriters happen to be English majors who didn't know what else to do, right? So they love this. They're like, oh my gosh, we get to use 17th century literature to write stuff. That's awesome. Since Perry Miller published Errand into the Wilderness, JFK, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama have all included the city on a hill as a central metaphor in their political rhetoric and speeches. It has become central to the American ethos and self-definition. Now, of course, there were certainly older ideas that America was special before that. just as there are for all nations and cultures. In the 19th century, French political writer Alexis de Tocqueville. Anybody ever heard of Alexis de Tocqueville? Us literary people are going to be like, yeah, we know him. He made a trip to America, and he wrote about it. And he's probably the first place that we actually have a literary record of someone describing the United States of America as exceptional. That's where we can say, yeah, he used that word. During the 19th century, that idea was at the center of some very important political and philosophical trends that had a major impact. Manifest destiny. Anybody know what manifest destiny is? Manifest destiny was the idea that some people were born to do special things, certain cultures were born to do special things, and they were divinely guided to do that, and that justified some pretty awful stuff, right? At the core of it, the idea of exceptionalism in any culture is often used to justify conquest and colonialism, right? So we are more special. We have figured it out, civilized. So it's good for us to go into this other place and civilize the people who are already there, to help them fix their culture, which is clearly inferior to ours. So this idea, manifest destiny, which was very popular in the 19th century, was used to dispossess Native peoples of their lands on this continent, right? Now, in the 1920s and the 1930s, communist activists used this description of America as exceptional in ways that were about class. And they said we were exceptional both in this country and out of this country, pros and cons depending on who was doing the talking, right? But the idea was that America was exceptional because it blurred class boundaries. And in the 50s, around the time Perry Miller was writing, it became popular to talk about how America was exceptional because it was, I would like you to pay attention to this, so good at blurring class boundaries that it was free of class conflict. Which sounds like fake news to me. Right? The other idea was that it was particularly abundant materially and was generally a place where liberal individualism and pluralism flourished. And of course, with a lot of those assertions and assumptions about our history as a nation, right? That the dominant narrative left some stuff out. But by the middle of the 20th century, there was a fairly solid, established idea that, first of all, America was exceptional as a nation. And second of all, that it was a city on a hill in its exceptionalism, which was meant that it was both to be an exemplar and ultimately a savior to the rest of the world. So in 2020, a Yale historian named Abram Van Ingen published a history of all of this rhetoric. It's a book entitled City on a Hill, A History of American Exceptionalism. And he describes a few different versions of American exceptionalism. In its earliest forms, from the 1790s to the early 1800s, you know, we've established a democratic nation, and right, this is an example, this is a model. In that time period, the language frequently used was that it was a light. It was shining a light on something. America had achieved something other nations would want to achieve, so we were lighting the way to something they would want to emulate. So for Van Engen, what he says is this is primarily a passive exceptionalism. The U.S. is a model nation. So think about what's happening after the American Revolution, right? Did the U.S. get involved materially in the French Revolution? No. We said, well, here we are, we've done this. And the French followed suit, but we did not materially engage or intervene in that, much to the dismay of a lot of contemporary politicians, right? But over the course of the next 100 years, and especially a little while later after World War II, in the era of Perry Miller, right, American exceptionalism began to be defined as something more active. With the return of the city on a hill rhetoric that was brought by, these scholars in the 50s and into the 60s, America came to be seen as exceptional, and not only to be emulated by other cultures, but also as something to spread actively. Now think about the original tone of that original passage. It's evangelical. Evangelical. So think for a minute, do we often think of our political agenda as evangelical? But I would argue that it is. That's a useful way to think about how we think about ourselves as evangelical, right? In other words, the U.S. started to think of itself more actively as a redeemer of other places in the world. Things where we needed to go in and fix things and help them get it right. This version, now here's an interesting twist that happens in 2012. In 2012, during the 2012 election campaign, the Republican Party purposefully adopted this particular version of American exceptionalism as part of their platform. There's quotes where they were specifically saying, they have a conviction that our country holds a unique place and role in human history, and that it was to be acted out and carried out on the world for America's direct involvement in intervening in other nations. Okay? Now I'm going to pause us here for a minute. I thought that was perfectly fine until a few years ago when I started thinking about it. Most of us have been raised, it is the role of this country to go into other countries and do stuff. But we need to think about that. We need to be curious about that and ask that question. This history outline I'm giving here is very broad. It's very overly simplified. But it is clear that the idea that America is special has been here with us from the beginning, and that the way it has been worked with is through narratives shaping cultural identity. It plays an important part in how we go about acting on the world stage. So I want to ask you, just in your own mind, to think for a minute. Can you think of an example in which the United States has acted as the intervener or the fixer in another culture, maybe on our own territory or not on our own territory, that has been problematic? We can all think of answers to that, right? So, what actually is the problem with that? Isn't recognizing what's special about our national ideals and governance a good thing? Isn't that a good thing in many ways? The answer is yes, of course, right? Many of us recognize, even while questioning this American exceptionalism, that of course the experiment in democracy that has happened in this nation is special and unique in certain ways. That's absolutely true and absolutely valuable. One could say the same thing about the unique qualities of any culture. Every culture has its unique and special qualities, traits, values, principles that are worth learning about. But if you study justice and race, and the history and the process of what happens in our culture, in those areas, you find that American exceptionalism gets used as a weapon for doing all kinds of things that are not okay. As Abram Van Engen points out, the basic assertion of American exceptionalism rests first on a key assumption that we have comparative superiority. Right? It's a comparative. So it's one thing to say America is special and cool. And it's another thing entirely to say that we're exceptional, which somehow suggests that we're head and shoulders above other cultures. It's not the same as saying, gosh, all cultures are so, like, think about this. Were any of us raised with, gosh, all cultures are so cool and so special? That is not how we were raised. We were not raised with, Canadians are so awesome. Mexico is so cool. It has such incredible cultural stuff going on, right? We were not raised with a cultural identity that says all cultures are awesome and cool and special and we can all learn from each other. We were taught something else. So scholars point out that exceptionalism, that idea assumes that we have the objective ability to make those assessments of other cultures, which I certainly wouldn't claim that. I would not claim the ability to assess whether or not somebody else's cultural norms are valid or invalid. That's just not Unitarian Universalist in a certain way, right? Right? So there's that. That's problematic in a bunch of different directions. And then we have another core foundational issue to look at that Van Engen points out, which is the storytelling part of it. Right? As we have just seen, Perry Miller had to make some pretty egregious exclusions to write a story that proved his version of American exceptionalism. We are witnessing that right now in our culture. Some pretty strong storytelling that may or may not be rooted in a whole lot of accuracy, designed to tell a narrative about the greatness of this nation. So the narrative of American exceptionalism has been adapted and adopted for centuries, really, but it's rooted in the various versions of that story are rooted in some core falsehoods about history. American specialness is absolutely real, but exceptionalism, if we define it this way, there's some problems with what we've left out of the history. And I just want to say this about my own personal experience. I love Perry Miller. He's one of my all-time favorite scholars. When I was a young grad student studying American history and American literature, I loved Perry Miller. I have all his books on my bookshelf in my living room to this day. I love some Perry Miller, right? I loved that narrative about American history. I still love many things about it. And as I've started to do the work of dismantling my own internalized racism and cultural biases, I've had to do some serious self-examination and scholarly reassessment of my own work. As a matter of fact, my PhD dissertation, which is about white settlers moving into native territory and how that was narrated by non-natives, which I thought was progressive, is solidly rooted in some scholarly right to make these assessments for other cultures. Some of you may remember a few years ago, we all read together as a congregation. We did some workshops on this, and this was something our denomination did. We all read Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. Some of you remember that? That was a powerful experience for many of us. And it's where many of us might have first encountered that phrase, American exceptionalism. And she talks extensively about what that is and the dangers it poses. She argues at great length that the idea of American exceptionalism has been used to justify racist policies and practices, and here particularly against Native North Americans. So Eric Forner is a Canadian journalist, and he said this in an article in the 2013 Montreal Review. At its best, the idea of American exceptionalism carries with it healthy pride in the freedoms Americans enjoy. But overall, the insistent claim for exceptionalism goes along with national hubris and closed-mindedness and offers an excuse for ignorance about the rest of the world. Since the United States is so exceptional, there's no point in learning about other societies. Their histories have no bearing. How many of us have traveled in other countries and heard what people in other countries tend to think about Americans? That bit about hubris, pretty much a lot of the rest of the world's like, yeah, those Americans are pretty proud of themselves, right? So this is an issue. There's no simple answer to it, but it's something we need to be mindful about. Scholars like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz might see this as passively ignorant, but some scholars, and I'm sorry, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz doesn't see it as passively ignorant. We're just being passively ignorant. We're just being clueless. But Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and other people say, no, we're being actively destructive. We're being actively destructive, and we're using this means to do it, and we're saying the ends are justified. It's okay to destroy cultures if they were inferior in the first place. We have a right to go in and tell them how to do things. So I'm going to ask you that opening question again. Hearing that history, how do you feel about the idea that America is exceptional? That it has, quote, a unique role to play on the world stage? What are the implications of that assumption? Here's what I think for myself. I would argue that nations, like individuals, all have inherent worth and dignity. We say that in Unitarian Universalism. That is our one of our foundational core beliefs. All beings have inherent worth and dignity. Can we extend that to nations? What happens when you try to do that intellectual exercise? I know that for me, that one's tough. There are a few examples where that's a little bit harder come up, right? But what if we could understand that each culture has its own special, exceptional qualities and gifts? That each culture has wisdom, which we would be served by honoring. When we place any one culture or nation over others, we tend to get ourselves into some trouble. If not in the short term, definitely in the long term. Pluralism was a core value of the founding ancestors of this colonial experiment that is the United States of America. All we have to do is ask the question, did they stick to it in the 1700s? And we can say, well, no. They had it as a value. They struggled with it themselves. They really struggled with it, right? But it was a value that I think most of us as Unitarian Universalists embrace, pluralism. But we have to ask the question, can we look at our own vision and short-sightedness about what that might mean? Give you this challenge as you think about this over the coming days and weeks. Ask yourself, where have you taken in a cultural narrative? Like I took in the narrative about the Pilgrims. I loved Perry Miller because he matched my identity. I love that identity. I am a Mayflower descendant, okay, right? Like I literally can trace the person on the Mayflower who was my ancestor, which is super cool until you get to the part of the story where his children raped Native women and were punished by paying in bushels of corn. Recorded in the records of that Plymouth plantation. I can literally look up the record where my super cool Mayflower ancestor had a son who repeatedly raped a Native woman and only had to pay some corn in recompense for that. It's really important that we think about the whole story, not just the cool part of the story. And the truth is that's personal for all of us in one way or another. So let's be courageous. Let us be people who can hold a complex story that says it is cool, the kinds of values that this nation was founded on, and it's complicated. And we need to be careful how we tell that story, and we need to be careful about how we use those assumptions. I hope that we can do that. So one of the things we do as a congregation is we do things to try to actively work on justice. I really encourage you to stick around for the workshop this afternoon with Kalil White, who is the Director of Operations at the bottom. They are working actively there to rebuild a community that was destroyed because some people thought it would be better to have other stuff there than their community. They just thought it'd be better to build some other stuff there. And so they destroyed a community that was existing. The Bottom's work, which we have been supporting for a couple of years now, and that we want to continue to support, is all about learning those stories right here in our neighborhood, right here in our local community, and getting engaged actively with understanding what that means for us. So Westside is doing a lot of things. As always, you can always make financial contributions. A big thank you again to those of you who contributed to our Canvas campaign. We have successfully created a great budget for the coming year. There are boxes in the back of the room. If you want to make a cash or check donation, you can use the QR codes. That is also true. If you're with us virtually, you can use the QR code to make a donation. We use those donations then to keep doing the work we do. If you choose to make a donation to our current Justice and Generosity partner, that is Knox Pride. So we'll be celebrating our own Pride celebration here in mid-June on the 22nd. But if you would like to make a donation to Knox Pride, you can do that directly. Any undesignated cash donations, so if there's cash donation that goes in our general fund box during this quarter, a portion of that will go to Knox Pride. So we're constantly working on trying to understand ourselves. Humans are not perfect. I have stopped beating myself up over loving Perry. I have stopped beating myself up over writing a dissertation that now when I read parts of it, make me kind of cringe a little bit, right? My Dr. Maya Angelou always said, when you do the best you can do, and when you know better, you do better, right? So one of our goals as a community is to constantly work to do better. So let's be courageous about that. So we're going to sing one more closing song. I'm going to invite the choir to come up. Same as our last song, you can join us if you like. The words will be up on the screen. And you can read them and just enjoy reading them. But this is also a song about how other cultures also have value as well as our own. So this is my song, and I'm going to invite the choir to come up and sing it.
In
as true and high as mine. My country's skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, hear my song, the God of all the nations, a song of peace for their land and for mine. So, if you would like to stand, join hands if you would like to do so, or hold your own hands. Pluralism in hand holding is totally welcomed here. We invite you to be plural in your hand holding. So, take a moment and ask yourself, first, what is special about you? What is special about you? There are many, many, many things about each of us that are special. And look around and notice that that is true of everyone in this room. Everyone in this room is special. And let's take a moment of incredible gratitude. I'm going to use a Southern word. We are blessed. We are uniquely blessed to live in this land. This land where we have the right to have a sermon like I just gave, where we have the right to disagree about things, where we have the right to talk about them. That is special. And let us continue to do that with open minds and open hearts and the willingness to learn and grow together as we are meant to do. Go in peace, go in passion, and go with a willingness to transform the world through your unique version of liberating love. May it be so.